Under the weight of 30 empires, the tribunal hall shimmered with artificial gravity and arrogance. Each species sat cloaked in centuries of conquest and comfort, surrounding a singular, solitary figure, the human. No guards, no weapons, no translator drone. Just one being among giants. His file, thick with violations, glowed before the assembly. Non-compliance, read the title. Below it, refusal to integrate, assistance to separatist worlds, and unauthorized weaponization of forbidden systems. Each charge was read aloud with theatrical exaggeration, to draw laughter, not fear. The counselors chuckled in turns, indulging each other like old friends mocking an uninvited guest. One of the Threxian judges, who measured morality by submission, clicked his claws and barked. Humanity, primitive, fractious, and apparently allergic to obedience. Laughter followed. Another, the archivist from Cytherin, added, They still rely on combustion engines. The tribunal wastes time even entertaining this case. The mocking chorus gained confidence. They laughed not because they were amused, but because they believed there was nothing to fear. The humans had no allies among the major blocks. Their colonies were scattered, resource poor, and ideologically volatile. No species had entered tribunal proceedings with less leverage or fewer friends. This wasn't justice, it was a ceremony of humiliation. And yet, something about the humans' silence unsettled them. Most defendants wept, begged, or protested. Some demanded cultural exemption. He did none of those. He listened. And in a room full of apex civilizations, that quiet attention felt heavier than any protest. A few minor species in the observer deck watched with curiosity, those whose homeworlds had once resisted tribunal orders and suffered sterilization protocols. They remembered humans during those times, not as conquerors, but as smugglers of food, medics without permits, transmitters of truth. The kind who didn't ask the tribunal for permission before saving lives. A projection lit the center platform, showcasing a covert Earth vessel dismantling a weapon platform in orbit of a protected world. More laughter. Evidence, said the Zundari prosecutor, of Earth's disregard for interstellar harmony. The humans taught rebels how to build jamming tech, primitives arming primitives. The human remained expressionless. Another clip, this time a battlefield. Human-built drones flying escort for a ship evacuating political prisoners from a penal moon. A violation of 3 neutrality clauses. The tribunal's mirth grew louder. A Rellan delegate remarked, They act like they're guardians of justice, yet they're nothing more than insurgents in formalware. Still, no words from the human. The tribunal chair, an ancient being who'd witnessed 6 galactic collapses, leaned forward. You were invited here to account for Earth's actions. And yet you offer no statement. Is silence your defense? Even now, the human said nothing. Not until the moment demanded meaning. Not until they had exhausted their laughter. Then he raised his eyes. And he spoke. Not with volume or drama, but with absolute clarity. You claim we violate peace. Yet you built your peace on fear, not consent. On silence, not agreement. The room didn't laugh. We did arm rebels, he said, after your fleets turned protest into massacre. We violated your codes when they became excuses to let oppression stand unchallenged. We interfered in your wars because those you crushed had no voice here. Some delegates shifted in their seats. You've labeled us unpredictable, he continued. We are. Because unlike your species, we don't kneel out of custom. We kneel only when we mourn our dead, or help others to their feet. The tribunal did not interrupt, though protocol allowed it. They didn't dare. Not now. You've judged us for weaponizing forbidden knowledge. But that knowledge was given to us, by your own defectors. Scientists who fled empires built on slavery. We didn't steal your secrets. We inherited them from your outcasts. And we put them to use to defend, not to conquer. One of the junior members opened their mouth to object, but no sound emerged. The mood had changed. You find our engines primitive. Our alliances inconsistent. Our methods chaotic. And yet we succeed, not because we are the strongest, but because we remember. We remember what it's like to be weak. We remember what it's like to be told we're lesser. And we remember how dangerous those memories become when shared. The room remained frozen. No smirks. No quips. Only breath held. So no, he said. We don't belong in your hierarchy. We were never invited. But we came. And when we were mocked, we stayed. When accused, we listened. And when asked to speak, we did. His final words weren't shouted, but delivered with razor-sharp calm. You laugh because you do not understand us. That was your first mistake. You stopped laughing. That was your second. The third is coming. Silence. Not the kind demanded by order. The kind earned by truth. And for the first time in recorded tribunal history, laughter was not the last sound a human made in that chamber. It was the first thing he silenced. The charges continued, now layered with detail and intent. Every word from the tribunal was meant to box humanity into a single narrative, dangerous, disobedient, destabilizing. One after another, representatives took turns presenting damning evidence, each more theatrical than the last. The Zaidari ambassador opened with a recording of a Terran transmission intercepted in a war zone. In it, a human commander advised the rebel cell on how to sabotage an orbital cannon. This, she said, is interference at the highest level. Humanity didn't merely observe the conflict, they escalated it. Another delegate submitted footage from a diplomatic summit on Varni's 4, where a Terran envoy refused to endorse annexation of a native species. The humans convinced the locals they had a choice. That is not their place. They undermined galactic unity for sentiment. A reptilian strategist from the Kelrax military consortium leaned forward. We studied their spread. They established contact not through treaties, but through aid drops, encrypted channels, and unregulated knowledge sharing. They don't colonize, they ignite ideological infection. And once a population begins to hope, it becomes impossible to control. The tribunal murmured in agreement. Earth had never signed the Core Concord. It had never declared allegiance to any of the 5 great powers. It stood apart, unclaimed, and unyielding. Every humanitarian act had been rebranded here as provocation. Every alliance as conspiracy. The Sithran archivist presented charts showing how regions once under stable imperial rule descended into revolt after human visitation. They call it uplift. We call it destabilization. But the numbers weren't lies. In the span of just 3 decades, 15 planetary governments had rejected galactic compliance laws after direct or indirect interaction with Terran envoys. 12 of those uprisings were successful. The pattern was undeniable, and to the tribunal, intolerable. The chair declared, Earth acts with impunity. It erodes structure. Every act of aid masks aggression. Every gift is a seed of sedition. The human listened, unblinking. More evidence followed. Unauthorized satellites above restricted zones, medical teams smuggled past quarantined borders, encrypted signal towers found on primitive moons. A warbred species claimed human intervention cost them control of 2 key mining colonies. They broadcast poetry and histories in languages we banned. The locals believed they were worth saving. To the tribunal, that was more than rebellion. It was ideological warfare. A silent vote was held to determine the scope of penalty. Not guilt. Guilt was never in question. Only punishment. Fines, embargoes, and interdiction were discussed. One faction pushed for complete isolation, to cut Earth off from trade, navigation grids, and interstellar relay systems. Another, more extreme group, suggested quarantine enforcement via orbital blockade. The rhetoric escalated because no one expected challenge. The human had not defended their position. And yet, the quiet had grown heavier, not weaker. The lesser species in the gallery, those who owed their current autonomy to Terran backing, stayed motionless. They had been warned not to intervene. Their silence, like the humans, was not consent but calculation. A high-ranking administrator from the Andari Syndicate outlined a list of broken treaties, all authored by Earth's representatives. Each, she claimed, was signed and then ignored when inconvenient. She concluded, They make promises to gain trust, then abandon procedure when principles interfere. The human finally moved, not to interrupt, but to place a small device on the table. It activated without fanfare, displaying the unedited text of those treaties. They contained clauses the tribunal had redacted in public records, conditions Earth had set for its cooperation. Conditions that were never honored. Promises of protection to local populations, freedom of religion, right to cultural self-governance, ignored by the powers that now cried foul. The room stilled again. It was one thing to accuse a species of lawlessness, another to discover the laws had been selectively quoted. The tribunal ignored the display. A vote was called anyway. The Kelrax delegate raised a question. Why have they never struck back? We sanctioned 2 of their colonies last year. They sent medicine in return. The chair dismissed it. Because they are weak. And arrogant. But others weren't so sure anymore. In the back rows, one silent observer noted that every one of humanity's so-called violations had one thing in common: they benefited the powerless, not Earth. There were no resource grabs, no territorial gains, no extraction contracts. Just intervention, then disappearance. The tribunal presented its final piece, a decrypted message from a rebel fleet captain thanking Earth for reminding us we are not alone. They called that proof of manipulation. But to some in the hall, it sounded like gratitude. The chair turned toward the human again, expecting protest. None came. And that absence echoed louder than any defense. He stood, finally, not because he was commanded, but because the silence had matured. Eyes locked on him, some amused, some expectant, a few uncertain. Then he began to speak, voice neither loud nor dramatic, but precise. You've called us a threat. You're not wrong. But not for the reasons you claim. He paused just long enough for his words to land. You speak of our weapons, yet yours span solar systems. You warn of our defiance, though you demanded submission without understanding. You declared us unstable, because we refused to conform. The hall remained quiet. Yes, we acted without approval. We sent aid where your embargoes starved civilians. We armed those you labeled insurgents, who were, in truth, citizens defending what little dignity your treaties allowed them. We defied your edicts not because we craved rebellion, but because your law demanded compliance to injustice. He looked directly at the Kelrax general. When your war engine sterilized the surface of Ardent 6, we evacuated its children. You called it trespass. We called it necessary. Eyes turned away. Others leaned in. We do not apologize for that. He shifted his gaze to the Zydari ambassador. You mock our ideology, say we infect others with hope. But hope is not a disease. Oppression is. A ripple moved across the room, too subtle to name. You believe in control. You call it order. We've seen where that leads. On our own world, long before we reached the stars, we learned what happens when a system is built to serve only the powerful. We tore it down, again and again, at great cost. We lost continents, generations, and still stood back up. Not stronger. Just more certain. His words had no theatrics. He made no appeal for sympathy. Only recognition. When our people burned under their own flags, we didn't run, we rebuilt. When tyrants rose, we didn't flee, we fought. Not because we are fearless, but because fear taught us how valuable freedom is. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Your kind laughs at our chaos. But that chaos is our resilience. We're not efficient, not uniform, not aligned to a single voice. That's what makes us dangerous. That's what makes us human. He gestured lightly, as if drawing no attention to what mattered most. We don't move as one empire. We don't think in unison. But when injustice appears, even in another sky, we remember. He walked forward one step. You say we arm the weak. Yes. Because someone has to. You call it interference. We call it responsibility. Another step. You accuse us of lacking tradition. Our tradition is to question. Our legacy is dissent. He glanced at the silent rows of minor species. You silence those who remember pain. We amplify them. Then he faced the tribunal head on. You accuse us of being unpredictable. You're right. Because we do not follow power, we follow principle. We can't be bribed with seats, or threatened with exile. That's why we are feared. Not for our strength, but for the impossibility of owning us. A long silence. No one moved. We didn't come to plead. We didn't come to justify. We came because our name was placed on trial by those who forget their own history. He raised a hand, fingers closed, not in aggression, but as emphasis. We have made mistakes. We have failed, repeatedly. But each time, we chose to learn, not to forget. We built memorials to our sins, not statues of conquest. His tone hardened. When your fleets bombed medical stations, we remembered. When you called it collateral, we remembered. When you laughed at survivors, we remembered. He leaned forward slightly. And now here you laugh again. No one did. He waited. In every corner of your tribunal, the oppressed watch. Not because you gave them justice, but because we reminded them what justice looks like. He stepped back. You've asked who we are. Now he gave them the answer. We are the species that refuses to look away. We are the voice you cannot quiet. The error in your equation. The variable you can't calculate. We are not anomalies. We are precedent. Then he said nothing. Because he'd said everything. We were not born in order. We clawed through fire and blood to define it. Before we reached the stars, we faced extinction by our own hands. Empires rose on earth and collapsed under the weight of pride, greed, and ignorance. We rebuilt each time, not better but wiser. Not perfect, but conscious of our failures. That is the inheritance we carried into the void, not a polished legacy, but a scarred will. You judge us by the chaos we wear openly. Yet it is that very chaos that tempered us. Our history is not a tale of easy victories, it is a catalogue of loss, pain, rebellion, and eventual reckoning. We did not erase the past, we recorded it in stone and circuitry, built museums not to glorify, but to remind. When we walk through the ruins of our ancestors' crimes, we do not cover our eyes. We study the ashes so the next spark doesn't consume us again. Your kind believes in control. But we learned long ago that control is brittle. What endures is understanding. You call weakness. We cultivate strength through failure. That is why your systems collapse when confronted by dissent, while ours evolve under the weight of it. You call us naive for trusting strangers, yet those strangers now stand in this hall because we did. You say our alliances are unstable. We say they are honest. Built not on domination, but shared purpose. Temporary perhaps, but real. Your empires enforce loyalty with threats. We earn it with action. When our colonies were isolated by embargoes, we didn't retreat. We improvised. We invented technologies not out of ambition, but necessity. You claimed we violated protocols by transmitting emergency medical data across restricted sectors. Yes, we did. Because we would rather break your laws than bury another innocent under them. When you sterilized the oceans of Tellan Prime to punish their defiance, we sent submersible biotechs to preserve their last gene sequences. Not because we were asked, but because it was right. No permission was requested. None was needed. You assume we're reckless because we don't wait for your approval. But what you call disorder, we call urgency. Where you delay, we decide. Where you hesitate, we act. You quote your ancient codes as justification. We have no such comfort. Our principles were forged in contradiction. We believed in freedom while practicing conquest. We claimed equality while building systems of exclusion. We failed ourselves. Repeatedly. That's why we can recognize when someone else is being failed. That is why we don't trust legacy, we trust effort. You declared that Earth's memory spreads unrest. You're right. Because we carry the memory of suffering not as a burden, but as a warning. Our greatest stories are not of conquest, but resistance. Not of domination, but defiance. The names we carve into monuments are not just leaders, but rebels, reformers, whistleblowers, and revolutionaries. We don't seek to control history. We seek to correct it. We don't rewrite truth to favor ourselves. We publish the contradictions and teach the next generation to question even their heroes. Your tribunal is built on the belief that order must be enforced. We exist to remind you that justice must be earned. Our species does not claim moral perfection. But we are not paralyzed by that imperfection. We confront it. We bleed for it. We build despite it. You fear our unpredictability, but it's not our methods you fear. It's our resolve. You see a species that survived its own extinction-level stupidity. A race that should have destroyed itself but didn't. That persistence unsettles you, because it means we do not break as easily as your statistics predicted. We are not here to ask for permission to exist. We are not here to trade our values for safety. We have come because the galaxy we encountered was not what we were promised. We were told we were joining a council of reason. What we found was a theater of obedience masquerading as law. And when we chose not to play the part written for us, you called it treason. But you wrote the wrong script. We do not bend into roles. We write our own. We remember every exile, every protest crushed beneath armored boots, every voice silenced because it spoke too clearly. We remember because we've lived it. And we won't allow it again, anywhere. You mistake that promise for arrogance. It's not. It's accountability. We have no gods among us. No chosen blood. No unbroken line. What we do have is memory. And that, more than any weapon, is what you should fear. You gathered here expecting silence, or surrender. Instead, you were made to listen. Not to threats, not to diplomacy, but to truth. You assumed humanity would flinch beneath your judgment. You miscalculated. We did not come to be forgiven. We came to be heard. You believe strength lies in submission. We believe strength lies in standing when it's inconvenient. And today we stood. The tribunal prepared its verdict long before this session began. You wrote us off as disruptive, labeled us as destabilizing because we refused to conform. But every point raised, every accusation thrown, every piece of evidence submitted was met not with denial, but with context. Not with evasion, but with clarity. You brought your charges. We brought reason. And reason is what cracked your certainty. You wanted the galaxy to see a rogue species put in its place. Instead, they saw a mirror, one that reflected what they have ignored. They saw the difference between compliance and conscience. You made a display of protocol. We made a statement of principle. Delegates who were prepared to condemn without hesitation now hesitate to vote. Those who once laughed now calculate. Not because we threatened you, but because we exposed the shallow foundation of your authority. It wasn't built on respect. It was built on repetition. Until now. One by one, voices began to shift. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but with purpose. Small powers spoke out, not to challenge you, but to agree with us. That your law isn't neutral. That your order doesn't protect, it preserves control. That you've forgotten what justice sounds like until it came from the species you feared the least. You accused us of spreading instability. Yet, in one speech, we caused your unity to tremble, not through force, but conviction. That should concern you more than any weapon we've built. You designed a system that couldn't be questioned. We questioned it, and it blinked. You assumed isolation would break us. It didn't. It refined us. You treated sanctions as shackles. We treated them as training weights. You weaponized borders. We adapted through them. You mistook resilience for arrogance. Now you're uncertain which it was. You anticipated retaliation. But we didn't need missiles or fleets. We needed one voice. Not to declare war, but to demand recognition. Not as a dominant force, but as a moral equal. That demand was made. And it was not denied. The final vote was called. And for the first time in the tribunal's recent history, the outcome was not unanimous. The motion to impose full isolation failed. The proposal for economic embargo was retracted. What remained was a formal censure, symbolic, toothless, and beneath the weight of everything that had already happened. You expected to strip us of legitimacy. Instead, you exposed your fear of it. When the gavel fell, you hadn't condemned us. You had acknowledged us. That is what you tried to prevent. Not Earth's rise, but its relevance. We didn't enter this chamber seeking approval. We entered knowing we would be rejected. But rejection does not weaken truth. It confirms the distance between what is and what should be. That distance is where we act. You can tighten regulations. You can redraw lines on your maps. You can warn your allies in whispers. But you cannot erase what was spoken today. The words now belong to the galaxy. They will reach oppressed systems where your broadcasts are filtered. They will pass through hidden channels and encrypted satellites. They will be repeated in hushed conversations and open protests. And every time they are spoken, the illusion you built will crack again. You created this tribunal to enforce unity. But today, unity fractured because of a single refusal to remain quiet. You cannot undo that. You may try to rewrite records, to recut footage, to bury transcripts under red tape. But somewhere, a translator drone has already uploaded our speech to a free network. Somewhere, a student on a censored world is reading it right now. Somewhere, a leader in doubt is finding resolve. That is your true loss. We leave this chamber not victorious, but visible. That alone shifts the balance. Because now, every time you silence a voice, someone will ask, what were they trying to say? We were not your enemy. We still aren't. But we are your reflection. And reflections do not lie. They reveal. You looked into ours and saw the things you buried. Now so will everyone else. You laughed before we spoke. You've remained quiet ever since. Let that silence echo longer than your sentence. Let it serve as the first honest precedent this tribunal has ever set. And let the record show, humanity did not beg. It revealed. It did not kneel. It stood. And it was heard.